Hello and welcome to Novelty Show, the podcast where we spill the truth about the ups and downs of writing and the ins and outs of the publishing industry. I'm Alexa.
I'm Kat.
And I'm Lainey, and this is episode 6, Worldbuilding.
We'd like to start this episode by thanking our patrons for voting on this topic, and stay tuned until the end of the show where we'll answer our Patreon question of the week.
All right, guys, so world building, it's like the big two of getting your story in order. And last episode, we talked about characters, crafting and developing layered and complex characters. So today is all about how to build complex and interesting worlds. And I think a good place to start is how much world building do we do before we start writing?
I think it's important to note what we all write typically. Maybe?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely going to color our conversation. World building is a very tricky topic to cover because the process for any writer is going to look really different. Like, the things you need to research and consider, it's going to vary widely depending on what kind of book you're writing.
With my background, all of my most recent projects are all fantasy. Because when it comes to fantasy world building, there's more things to consider, and it's sometimes different to kind of craft this whole world versus a world like our modern world where we're all pretty much familiar with it.
Yeah, instead of adapting like a contemporary world to a contemporary story, you have to make up a lot more stuff.
Absolutely, though of course there are world building elements that go into contemporary, which we are going to talk about. We'll talk about a lot of basic things that will impact any genre or category. But first, I just do want to disclaim that world building is so much more than setting, and we are going to talk about all of these kind of other elements, and those include politics, religion, class, gender. It's a backbone of story logic and how that's going to interact with your character and plot. So world is so much more than a laundry list of things. It's about a complex interaction of systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Alexa, how much do you do beforehand?
It depends. I do have to have a pretty firm grasp of, I'd call it the logic of my world. So kind of the essential order of my world. It doesn't have to be every single detail. So I don't need to know exactly how the politics work or even religion or what have you. But I do need to kind of know who the players in the world are, and generally, I guess the question I ask myself, and I think this probably comes up with fantasy world building as well for you guys, when the question is what's the inspiration of my world, fantasy or sci-fi, and how close to modern reality do I want to stay? Like, am I going to run parallel to what is familiar to me? Am I going to try to write something idealistically completely different? So that is to say, I do like to think, is this a capitalist world? Because that's pretty easy to write because it's familiar.
Mm-hmm. For me, I pay a lot more attention to setting. Setting I know pretty well going into the project. It's mostly the rules and the politics that I tend to throw things out there in my first draft, see what I like and see what makes sense to the world and what sticks. And then I'll go back in the revision process and kind of clean that up. I do a lot of contradictory things in my first draft when it comes to rules of the world and laws of the world, just because I'm trying to see what makes more sense for this kind of environment.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd say in terms of how much I figure out beforehand, it's all about character for me. The world is intrinsically tied to character. Generally, I do less pre-writing than a lot of people, but before I start, I need to know who is my main character, where are they, why are they there, and how does that setting, that environment, that aspect of the world impact the main journey of the plot.
Well, for me, it really depends on the project. I have one project that I was much more in depth about the world building ahead of time. But in general, my process is probably similar to Lainey's in that I start with just a basic setting kind of, And it's in the first draft where, I'll throw out different rules or different politics, different world dynamics, and see what sticks. My world doesn't really come together and feel like a real world until I'm deep in revisions. Because, I really need to know my characters and my story and like enough of how that intersects with the world to get started. But to really fully develop the world, I need to have a better grasp on my characters and the story to figure out like the larger role that the world needs to play.
And actually thinking about it, I think my world building, I probably do more prep on the world building than I do any other aspect of the story. And I am thus probably more similar to outliners in that sense.
Interesting.
Because I was just thinking about it. So for my sci-fi, which is a post-apocalyptic setting, I actually did map out all of the ships, how they got to where they got, and what their primary functions were and their environments before I started writing. And for my current project, which is set at a boarding school, I actually did a lot of research to develop what my boarding school was. I figured out where it was. I mapped out campus in my mind. I developed the demographics of this school before I started writing. So I guess I do more world building than I thought ahead of time.
Yeah, that's
but
a
I
lot
don't
of prep.
necessarily. That's a lot for me. But I don't necessarily write it all down. Some of it is kind of in my brain. But I always like to think of that establishing shot, so that snapshot that you're inevitably going to get right at the beginning of your book in your first chapter, where I do want to establish a very firm sense of place.
I know that we are going to be doing a episode on research soon, but I did want to touch on the fact that for me, in my pre-writing for world building and setting, I tend to do a lot of visual research for this. So I'll watch movies, I'll watch documentaries and television shows, and I know they're not completely accurate most of the time, but it gives you a sense of atmosphere, and that's usually the kind of thing that I'm trying to capture when I'm writing this kind of world. It's mostly the atmosphere than the historical accuracies or whatever. But I love looking at picture books that have like a lot of detail and like art, but I guess that's more into like the research aspect of it. But I do like doing that before I start writing the world, because I'm a visual person. So I feel like I never have a problem with like white rune syndrome, because I'm always describing everything in my first draft.
Well, to that end, I guess the question becomes, how do we pick where we're going to set something? Like, how do we arrive at that first spark of world building? Like, where does it start for you?
I think it depends on the project, because for like my pirate project, I'm like, okay, time to watch some things about pirates. So I watched the Pirates movies. I watched Black Sails. I got some really great books, and that was how I tried to capture that kind of feeling when I started writing.
Yeah, for me, it really depends on the project. Like with Storyteller, which is about, a modern aspiring author who gets kind of trapped in her high fantasy story. My goal for that was just like high fantasy world. I wanted to really dive into different high fantasy world building tropes and like, play into different religions and mythological creatures and, the dragons and knights and all that, high fantasy standard world building stuff. So I very intentionally went into it with like high fantasy world building basics and how I can subvert certain tropes and like play around with that. But for my current project, the spark of the story was a love story. It's a relationship between these two people. And while the world plays a role, it is secondary to this relationship. So the world is more catered around, what is going on in the relationship, what these characters need from the world, what they need from each other, and how the world sort of plays against that dynamic.
So it sounds like definitely that's one that came out of your characters, and that's definitely one place that world can start. I'd say personally, half of my projects start with simply, wouldn't it be cool if? And that can be a great starting point for world building. It sounds like that's what it was for you, Lainey, meaning you love pirate stories, and it's like well, wouldn't it be cool if I played with the setting? Or for your Borgia's inspired one. It's like, wouldn't it be cool if I did this? And that's definitely what my sci-fi was. It was a wouldn't it be cool if, because I wanted to play with resource scarcity. And I also wanted to do a Jane Eyre retelling. And it was a combination of like, wouldn't it be cool if I combined Battlestar Galactica with Jane Eyre? And that's what kind of sparked my imagination. The 100 as well kind of sparked my imagination. That's where the resource scarcity came in. But my new one actually came out of, I need X to happen. So where and why would it be most conducive to facilitate my plot? And so the reason I arrived at a boarding school rather than any other kind of high school is A, I love the trope, but B, you remove parents when you isolate your teen characters at a school. Kat, you know what I mean, because you've also done one. And also it gives an excuse to have kind of characters who seem way more mature and entitled and privileged than they have any right to be, because boarding schools are a microcosm of kind of teen behavior, at least in a tropey way, because there's like boarding schools in media and there's boarding schools in reality, and they don't always meet, but we're given certain allowances in media to make our boarding schools pretty insane. Right.
I mean, not just boarding school, high school in general is
high school.
It's a place. You're removed from the rest of the world. You're in this very small bubble with the same people for 4 years, and you learn like the hierarchies and the policies of like interacting in that type of a setting, and then the rest of the world isn't anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I actually think that when it comes to contemporary world building, we can touch on this briefly because we mostly write genre, the three of us. But I find contemporary world building actually quite fascinating because it is all about the choices you have to make of what you are going to pull from reality. And you do have to make questions about like pop culture. Like how much does pop culture impact your story? Technology is actually nowadays a big question to answer. Like, if you set something now, you can't ignore technology or social media, and that can definitely impact your characters and plot and your story. You need to consider demographics comes into play in a contemporary story in a way that I don't think people always realize. And part of fleshing out a world and making it feel real is considering the literal real world and kind of populating your story and your world with those real things. And then also just real world hobbies and interests. I had to decide high school. It's like, well, we're all defined by our extracurriculars. They say a lot about us and they really direct a lot of character choices. And so I decided that I was going to center some stuff around crew because I wish I'd rode crew. And that was a story choice that really impacted the direction that the things went. So a world building choice, rather. It was a world building choice. So there is a lot that goes to contemporary. So I don't want it to get any short shrift. And we want to definitely encourage anyone listening who writes contemporary set stories. Just know that you have to do just as much work as a fantasy or sci-fi writer. The work is just really different.
Yeah, I think contemporary is so hard because a few years ago, I tried writing a contemporary. It was more of like a fast-paced, kind of political, futuristic, but it was still very much in the real world. But it was so hard for me to like figure out the world because there's so many restrictions and rules to contemporary that I felt like I'm going to do this wrong. People are going to call me out and say this is impossible. That's where I find a little bit more freedom in building my own worlds with fantasy because I feel like I can do whatever I want over there. But yeah, I give major props to contemporary world building.
Yeah, especially like with fantasy, you do tend to make up more on your own. You do have that freedom there. But with contemporary, like you have so much real world information and it really comes down to choosing what to include, what to incorporate, and how much. You know, if you're writing a contemporary with, queer characters, how much of like the queer political scene are you going to include in your novel, because, you know, in the real world, like, queer issues are constantly talked about. So how much are we going to talk about it in this contemporary? How big of a factor is it there?
And also, it's worth talking about kind of like, I call them like contemporary with extra, because these kind of contemporary questions come in a lot of genres, such as urban fantasy, paranormal, where like the base of the world is grounded in our reality, but then you have to do world building around the extra. So, Kat, I know that you've done this. I've done this as well, because I've written an urban fantasy. Like, how do you approach world building with those kinds of stories? Like, what kind of extra things do you need to take into consideration?
It's a little bit difficult to articulate like a strategy, because I've been raised on so much urban fantasy, and like Buffy, where it's, you know, a very modern world, or, you know, modern for the 90s when it was being filmed.
We tried.
But, you know, we have all the fantasy elements. Like, I personally love that juxtaposition. So, but I don't quite know how to articulate like what you choose to incorporate and not. It's kind of, it's something that I just kind of feel, and then, you know, I get feedback from readers who tell me like what needs work and what is working.
Well, it's interesting about like the urban fantasy, because the typical trope is that this extra world building is mostly secret to everybody but the main character and like a select other people.
Right.
I think it would drastically change if it's more, I don't know, like True Blood, where everybody kind of knows that vampires are a thing and all this other stuff.
And then that's almost second world or alternate reality almost. Mm-hmm. And so I guess the thing, what you as the author are making the choice of essentially what the linchpin of your world building is going to be. And I think another question that comes up that kind of factors into this, I think secret versus not secret is a really good one to consider for anything that is like urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy, and so on. But also the question of technology versus magic, because typically if you decide to go with technology, you are going to be writing something that's more sci-fi. And if you go with magic as essentially the backbone explanation for the extraordinary in your world, then you're usually in more fantasy territories. That said, there are like advanced genre options where you can do both, but let's just talk about 101 here. Let's not overly complicate our worlds. And actually, that is a good note. If you throw the entire kitchen sink into your world building, it can actually be too much.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the whole, like, sci-fi versus fantasy thing, like, that nuance kind of gets explored in all sorts of different subgenres. Like, if you look at vampire mythology, you can take a more sci-fi, speculative, you know, it's a virus, it's science-based approach to it, or you can totally take a more fantasy approach to it, where it's more mythical, you know, maybe they can turn into bats. Just different directions of where you want to take your vampire mythology, for example.
And so then the key thing, world building is essentially all about making specific choices, understanding why you're making them, doing your research, and again, we're going to have an episode where we dig into how you actually do all of this kind of research, and essentially establishing rules for your world. I think one of the most critical things is ensuring you have an internal logic and a set of rules for whatever your world is, and then you don't break them. Because for me, where worlds will fall apart for a reader is when the internal story logic doesn't hold up.
I kind of fall victim to this sometimes. It's because I have too many ideas, and I try to put too much into the world building or building like a magic system.
Magic systems are hard.
Yeah, I guess that's like a whole other beast entirely. But I would say, like, every time the one piece of advice I try to implement every time I'm creating these worlds and these rules is go simple. The simpler is the most easiest to understand. It's easiest to convey to your reader, and it doesn't complicate things. It's easier to follow. The rules are easier to follow too.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to stress that you can't reinvent the wheel every single time, though there is a very fine line between borrowing or heavily leaning on someone else's famously kind of established world building or rule and developing your own, meaning you can't just copy the magic system from Harry Potter, even though the magic system from Harry Potter is actually quite tropey and
it's pretty basic.
It's pretty basic, and meaning the individual parts of it aren't that original, but it's the way that it was all put together that makes it very specific to that world. And so same thing with various vampire books and lores and mythology and the choices that those story creators made. You always have to be very careful playing in established genres because nothing is original, and yet you have to try to be original, and every choice matters.
Yeah, you have to. This is why reading widely is so important, because when you put out a book, you're kind of in conversation with other books in that genre that are very popular. You know, you're kind of joining the society's conversation around these books, especially if you go for something as popular as like Harry Potter. Like, you can't write a book about a young person going to a magic school without realizing that you're going to be compared to Harry Potter, and you're like kind of joining that conversation.
Exactly. And to your point, Lainey, it is that line between, it is generally better to go simple because just throwing more stuff into the mix doesn't make your world better. A desperate attempt to make it be unique isn't always better because you can actually overcomplicate things. And sometimes the best thing to do is exactly make it very straightforward because, well, essentially you can't copyright magic, period. It's the specificity where things get messy, or with vampires or what have you. So meaning if you have vampires that sparkle, honestly you can't, because that's Twilight. That is so specific to Twilight. Mm-hmm. Though, watch, someone will fight me on that. I don't know. I personally think that is so specific to Twilight. But that's actually a great example of an author who is trying really hard to subvert tropes and develop their own specific world. And it's up to you, the reader, to decide whether or not you feel it worked. I personally find sparkly vampires freaking ridiculous. But then it's just not for me. Vegetarian vampires as well, though that's always fun because Angel was kind of a vegetarian vampire as well, right, on Buffy, and I did quite like that kind of internal character struggle, which is a great actually example of how character and world does interact. It's world stories that will impact character development. And yeah, all we're talking about is magic and vampires. Whoops.
I love it.
Well, and so those are great kind of urban fantasy choices, like, you know, kind of based on reality choices, but let's talk a bit more about high fantasy. And Lainey, I think you have the most experience writing high fantasy. Where do you start? Where do you extrapolate from your starting point to build that world?
It is all about the visuals for me. That is really how I nailed down the world. I mentioned what I did with the pirate story. With my other project, it's kind of based around religion and Italy. So I watched the Borgias and I did a lot of research into them. I think all of my projects have some kind of historical inspiration to it. One of my projects is inspired by the Industrial Revolution of America. One of them is inspired by Renaissance Italy. And one of them is inspired by pirates. I don't know, time period, 1700s for pirates. So I feel like that's a great base with a lot of world building, is that you kind of want to work off of something that you're familiar with or you can be familiar with.
And then from there, how do you make decisions about, for example, language? Do you think about language or politics, geography? How do you work on geography for your world building?
I actually do create maps. I will... Yeah, so it's not, they're not great maps. I'm not some great map maker, but I will like kind of sketch out something because I want to pay attention to rivers and mountains and how that affects how people travel, because a lot of my stories have a lot of traveling in it. So it's really important to kind of map out how long would it take to get from point A to point B with a mountain in the middle of the route. it's just really trying to make everything feel real and believable. I think that's like the most believable. What are seasons like in certain parts of the of each world? Country, boundaries, alliances. It's a lot to think about. And some of those things I work out while I'm writing it.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I definitely, in the sci-fi, for example, I developed my politics, which kind of gets into alliances and kind of that messiness. I developed it as I was writing, for sure. But you bring up a really great point that I think is like the unspoken thing in all world building. And it goes back to story logic, but logistics. Because you mentioned the physical geography and weather, and you should definitely always consider the logistics of how things actually work in your world. You know, is it free trade? Is it black markets?
Right.
Is it the literal modes of transportation available to the characters? Obstacles? I think actually weather is a big one. Mine is set in, my current project is set in the winter, the dead of winter in Massachusetts, and that impacts literally how much my characters can be outside and how I have to kind of describe how they feel when they are outside.
Right.
Another thing, I think this is also really important when it comes to countries and stuff, is what like their economy is like, and what is like, what's their main source of income, and
Yes.
also like importing and exporting with other countries. I think about that a lot too. Like, what is making this country super rich, and then what is making this country really struggling to survive.
I consider that a lot in my sci-fi. I gave every ship in my fleet a utilitarian purpose. They had to have a primary export, or else I was like, why are they even here? And then actually working backwards, I was able to use that in my... So that's the book, the first book that was published. And the second book is kind of a prequel. Like, it takes place sooner. And I was actually able to use the economic perspective, the economic point, to create conflict in that story. I think a lot of people forget about economics, actually, and economics drive worlds in ways that I don't think we always realize.
I also, when writing high fantasy, I'm not a very visual person. Like in general, I don't really do like aesthetic boards, and like I suffer from white room syndrome a lot, where like people are just talking in a blank room. But drawing a map when I'm doing a fantasy world is absolutely one of my first steps, because, you know, I want just a basic idea of the layout of what this world is. And Lainey, like you said, my characters are also traveling a lot. So I wanted to know, like, from what city they're going to, like how they travel. And then a lot of the bigger picture stuff that you guys were talking about, like the different weather, the different climate areas. Like, this is a foresty area, this is a desert area. The different, like, what do they export? What do they import? I also like to have sort of some general, like, are the people here religious? What kind of religion do they follow? Other cultural things, like what kind of holidays they celebrate. What days are important to them? How do they tell time and like track the week and the month and the years and everything? So just putting a little bit of thought into this and kind of setting, like, building a very broad strokes world for my characters to play around in, and for the details to like come up through the drafting.
Something to just kind of warn writers on, just because we're essentially talking about developing complex systems. And I saw a review of a book recently, and it said it phrased something in such a specific way that it really kind of cracked something open about world building for me, a warning about world building for me. And that was that the world of this work, they said it felt like a theme park. And I was like, that is really fascinating to me. And that is that the warning is not to make things feel surface, make them feel too shiny and perfect and like an amusement park, that you do need to think about the complexity of the systems, make them feel organic and real, to make the world feel like it has a history, even if it's not on the page. And also that I think speaking to that specific thing is to gritty things up a bit. Like, the real world has sharp edges. And I think you do have to take care to make sure that those sharp edges are present, even if they're not right in the reader's face.
And yeah, add contradictions, you know, make things a little bit messy because that is reflective of the world.
Oh, and also speaking to your map point, I think creating maps or diagrams is a great world building tool, not just for when you have like a fictional land, but I drew a very bad diagram of my spaceship for my first published book, because I realized to have my characters move through the space and for any sense of continuity, I actually had to know exactly where every single room was so that I could describe the logistics of going places. Because I did this after my first draft, because I realized, I was like, I have her going upstairs at one point, and I'm like, but on this, I have it on the same level in another part of the book. And so I actually drew a bad diagram. And for my boarding school, I didn't write anything down, but I created a mental map of the layout of multiple dorms, because it was really important that I kind of understood how the characters would move through the space.
I actually created a full-on map for my boarding school. You know, I have like a map of the grounds layout, and then also
I probably should,
and then also a little map of what the dorm room would look like where the beds and the desk are. Which, you know, obviously that's not going to be included in the final book at all. But
I literally described my room layout.
I don't describe it in enough detail that I don't think someone could recreate it how I imagine it. But like, I just needed to make sure that the version I was describing worked. And just to keep things consistent, you know, like if they leave the dorm and they go to the left, that's always the library. You know, it's not like one day they go to the left and they end up in the cafeteria. You know, it's just gives you a sense of consistency, I guess. Yeah.
It's consistency, and it's a vivid and consistent sense of place.
And just making sure it works, too. And it's not like your library is sitting on top of your cafeteria because you've described them as, like, both in the exact same place.
And something else I think we can get into is essentially almost like proper nouns and naming things and creating... I hesitate to say brands, except sometimes it's literally brands, because this is another place where I think worlds feel distinct and specific, and storytellers are able to set themselves apart. In urban fantasy and dystopia, this tends to be proper noun syndrome, where every single freaking thing
is a proper noun.
Is a proper noun. And you can definitely do too much of it. But at the same time, that's definitely what makes worlds feel distinct. I like the example of True Blood because, in fact, isn't True Blood the name of the blood brand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without the E.
Yeah, and like literally that series created the brand of synthetic blood, and that was so specific. It told you that there was a complex system where there was a manufacturing chain, that this thing existed, and that's something that is very specific and trademarkable to that world. And you want to have those pieces in a more original world. So anything that's fantastical, you should take steps to create those things. The proper nouns of your world, the products. Though actually, speaking of that, in contemporary, you do have to be careful because some things are trademarked and you can't just put those brand names in your book. So instead of saying Kleenex, you need to say tissues.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that you were just talking about, True Blood, and how, you know, like they have the synthetic blood. I think that's a really important point to think about how even a small element or a seemingly small element of world building can have an impact. Because you think about that blood and you think about, like, you know, scientists developed it, you know, what it meant for the vampires. They were able to come out of the vampire closet, so to speak, and be public about being vampires. There's it changed society so much from that one small thing. And so just looking at the impact and sort of the ripple effect of your world building. So it doesn't feel like it's just an isolated element, but it's all very incorporated.
Well, and actually what that really incorporates into that we haven't talked about yet is the ethics and morality of your world and choices. Because essentially True Blood does this, Buffy does it, Twilight does it. Again, we're just, this episode's about
all the vampires.
All the vampires. But actually, I think most vampire stories do address the moral and ethical questions about killing living creatures. And that is often an ethical backbone of the world building of that kind of story. You find that in a lot of paranormal, in fact. And I think that's one of the appealing things about the genre. And then in fantasy, instead of, do you kill people to survive for food, it's do you kill people to survive in war? That becomes an ethical, moral quandary that is the backbone of your world building. And I think that those choices and ideas go into a lot of world building in ways that we don't necessarily realize. And anytime really you make political choices in your world building, you are making ethical and kind of moral decisions, or at least you are positioning your characters around questions. And I think that's actually where world building can get really deep and interesting. It's giving the reader a lot more to chew on, even if they don't realize that that's what they're chewing on. And usually it all centers around character choices.
I think what you said about questions and like raising questions of the world's like morality and ethics is really interesting, because that can play into story and character choices so much. That's a way of like how world development can help you further develop your characters and just your story, your general plot. Like you can incorporate new questions to tackle. Like with vampires, since that seems to be the theme of this episode, one common question is like, are they alive? Like, are they human? Do they count as human? What does it mean to be human? They look like a human. They have a lot of the same thoughts, but they are also battling like this inner demon. It can also be a metaphor for battling inner demons. Like just that sort of piece, that element of like, oh, vampires are in this world, can add so much to it.
Well, and that also speaks to certain genre conventions and tropes, including in the world building and character, are tied to themes and themes that they typically explore. And so when you make your world building choices, you should probably be conscious of that. So it's definitely important when you are making genre choices and world building choices to know what, again, we said earlier, consume a ton of story in whatever you're exploring, so you know what's been done, you know what's well trod, but also you know what these stories usually explore, so that you're making conscious and thoughtful world building choices that exist around the existing canon.
Yeah. I know theme is kind of a subject that, we all complain about, like, we have to study in school, like, what are the themes of this piece? Like, I don't know. But knowing the themes of your story and kind of working off of that to incorporate like world building elements can be so helpful. If your theme is, like love conquers all, then you can put little echoes of that into the world to either reinforce that idea or challenge that idea. And it can help you like strengthen your themes.
And something that we haven't really talked about yet is considerations of race, class, gender, queerness, and other such intersections in world building. They're definitely important, and that they actually tie so closely to character that it's almost like a separate hybrid topic of choices you make with world and character. And it is definitely important to consider those real world things when you're developing worlds, whether it's a contemporary story or a fantasy or a sci-fi story. And what's really most important is just to be aware of real world context, modern real world context for any of these kinds of, I hesitate to say hot topics, but there's certainly things where these are people's real identities and real lived experiences, and you want to reflect a spectrum of the world and humanity in our stories, but it's definitely important to think about the choices you make in your world building. For example, one thing that comes up a lot when people discuss high fantasy world building is that high fantasy worlds tend to default to white. So it might just be kind of interrogating, what does race mean in your world? And is there a historical and cultural context for race in your world? And how does that impact your story?
I think the main note here is to just be careful when borrowing from real life cultures. Like there are no rules of like do or do not. it's just sort of something that you have to navigate to the best of your ability to engage with readers, particularly readers from the cultural background that you were borrowing from, have them take a look at your work and give feedback on that. And to just be careful about stereotypes, because like not only can stereotypes be harmful, but also they're boring in books. You know, we're all about subverting the stereotypes and the tropes and bringing in an unexpected aspect.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of resources you can find within like the community that you can find some of these things. Like, isn't there the Writing the Other? Isn't that like a Tumblr page, or is that a blog?
I think it is.
Yeah, but so there's definitely resources that you should be searching for when writing the other.
Yep, and so ultimately it's just a matter of kind of balancing real-world elements and inspiration in your world building, but picking and choosing what elements you kind of want to extrapolate from and what's important to your world, because no world can possibly do it all, because you can't fit that all on the page.
Right.
So one of the major pitfalls, we've talked a lot about the prep work that goes behind building a world, but then actually implementing that world into your writing. Everybody knows the term info dumping, and we all try to avoid it. So what are some tips that you guys have to avoid info dumping?
Well, my main tip is that when I'm drafting, I don't avoid it. I'll have entire sections where I'm just like rambling for 3 paragraphs about how this fantastical element works. And it's in revisions that I'm like, okay, this is 3 paragraphs of how this works. I need to like narrow down like what are the important key points and how can I sprinkle that throughout a different section that's not just like this wall of info dumping text. So I go ham with the info dumping when I'm drafting because I'm telling it to myself. I'm trying to teach myself and like come up with it still. So I'll just like free write, get it out there. And, once it's out there, then I sort of parse it back.
I also do that a lot I do that mostly with setting. I'll describe things for 3 paragraphs just so that I understand where I'm at and where my characters are and what they can play around with. When it comes to info dumping, I also kind of tend to do that a lot in my first draft. But one tip that my mentor from Author Mentor Match actually gave me was that there's ways to sprinkle in world building through dialogue. So I've been trying to do that a lot more in one of my revisions because it does feel more natural when characters are kind of talking about it. You might not understand it completely, but it's something that the characters would naturally talk about.
Right. And I imagine that's where, the pages of info dumping really help because now you understand so much more about the world that you can be like, oh, I know this entire paragraph. I can sort of sum it up in one line of dialogue that this character says.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And another thing that I do is I think about set pieces I can create, which are essentially opportunities to show my world building through character interactions. Sometimes it is dialogue, but I sometimes have to invent scenes that will best showcase whatever world building I want to get across, which is one of the reasons I love party scenes. I probably write them too often, but you'd be amazed what you can say about your world in any really social scene, because you can say things about class and the food, fashion, sense of place, geography, just by having your character interact in a very specific social setting. So you think about whatever that very distinct social setting is for your world. So, for example, in my boarding school book, I open in the cafeteria because you can say a lot about a school and other students in such a specific place in a high school, or it could be in the hall at the lockers, a specific classroom. In sci-fi or fantasy, it could be a scene at court. You can say a lot about your world if there's royalty involved in it with a well-placed court scene. So it's whatever that scene is that is going to work to show your world building, so that you don't need those long info dump paragraphs, because you're letting your reader infer and learn things through interesting and dynamic scenes. And ultimately, you have to trust your reader. I think that's another thing where in books where you see lots of info dumping, very often it's because the author doesn't trust the reader to be carried along by the story and learn things later. There's this idea that we have to spoon feed our readers everything up front. So it's just a matter of pulling that back and knowing the balance of how much to tell them versus not tell them.
Yeah, I think that's a bad habit of newbie writers that I was definitely totally guilty of, where I wouldn't trust them to be able to follow the story. I was like, okay, you need like a crash course in how this world works before you're able to understand this scene. And that was just more of my flaws as a writer at that time, not trusting myself and not knowing how to incorporate that info naturally into the scene. So it really is just about finding a balance.
And just one more tip about communicating world building info is I find that one way to do that is through characters, specifically authority figures. Who's on the top of the pile in your world? And you can usually use introducing and showing and having your main character interact with that character to tell your reader a lot about the systems in place and rules of the world. Like, we learned more about the world of the Hunger Games through the District 1 tributes than anyone, really. I think they were that contrast of, like, this is the status quo, and this is how far from this evil status quo our heroes are.
Right.
Everything comes back to the Hunger Games, guys.
And vampires.
Yeah.
And vampires. Now it's time for our Patreon question of the week from Stanislav. How would you guys go about writing a love triangle? What would you do to make it feel compelling? So who here has written a love triangle?
I just finished writing a love triangle, and I feel like everybody kind of has a love-hate relationship with love triangles. There are some books that I've read where they're really, really good, and I'm like, who are they going to choose? And then there's other ones where I'm like, this is not very good. And I think it comes down to how fully realized all three of the characters, or four, how many people are in your love triangle, are. So there's sometimes like very obvious who he or she's going to choose, because the one love interest is like really three-dimensional.
Perfect.
Right. But then some of them are like weaker characters, and they don't feel very full. They feel very two-dimensional. So why would I want to root for one of a character that I don't really feel that attached to? I think the most important thing to do with love triangles is make all three of the characters like matched when it comes to character development. They all need to have wants. They all need to have needs and character motivation. What are they going to get out of the relationship? What are they not going to get out of the relationship? If any of those life or death kind of situations when it comes to love triangles are really affect how the reader will get attached to a certain suitor or the character as a whole or the relationship.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I find really compelling in a love triangle is when the person who is caught between two people, they could really go either direction. Like, it really is truly up in the air, and it's like, who are they going to end up with? And it depends on like elements playing out in the story that drive them to one person or the other. Like, if the story weren't happening, if the plot weren't happening, they could honestly end up with either person, but because of the way the story progresses, it narrows it down their choices. So it's like, oh, they really can only be with that one person. Like, that's the right person for them.
And it shouldn't be obvious from the outset, because I think when a love triangle feels unsatisfying, it's literally the crux of the plot that makes the one person just such an obvious choice that there is less satisfaction in the other leg of the triangle. Like, for example, not to use Twilight, I'm so sorry, but I think that's a perfect example. The point of the Twilight series is that Edward is her soulmate, whether you like it or not. So Jacob was never going to be an option. And I know people will fight me on that. I also feel, I mean, the point of the Hunger Games is not a love triangle.
Right.
The movies hyped a love triangle that didn't really exist in the book, and that's the thing. In the book, the end game was so crystal clear. who it was going to be. And I am Team PETA. I named my cat after him.
Right.
But that's one where it's like, but I think that's a perfect example that it wasn't actually a love triangle in the books. The movies made it a love triangle, but I think that's why it was an unsatisfactory love triangle in the movies, because it was never going to happen.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure both love interests are fully fleshed out and completely viable options to the bloody end. The story elements that drive them towards one person should hit after the midpoint, let's say. Like, you have to keep the suspense up, essentially, and I think a lot of love triangles fail to do that.
All right, that is our episode. Again, thank you to all of our patrons for your support. You can check out our page at patreon.com/noveltyshow, where our patrons can suggest topics, ask questions, vote in polls, and join our exclusive Discord.
We also broadcast live shows on YouTube. You can subscribe to our channel, Novelty Show. Follow us on Twitter at Novelty Show for updates and announcements.
If you like us, please subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice, and we would really appreciate it if you could rate and review us on iTunes and Google Play. Doing so helps bump us up in the ratings and helps other listeners find us. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, happy writing.